social entrepreneurs identify a stable but inherently unjust equilibrium and then envision a potential new and more just status quo or way of being, and then apply their creativity and their networks to build an ecosystem around it so that they create a new and more just equilibrium.
Welcome back, everybody. Rich Brubaker, founder of Collective Responsibility, here today with another episode of the Mission Driven Podcast. Through this podcast, I'm speaking with the social innovators, entrepreneurs, academics, leaders of this space about the work they're doing to tackle the big challenges they face in their community, country, economy, or environments. In this episode, I'm extremely honored to be joined by Teresa Chahine, who is a faculty director for the Social Innovation Initiative and senior lecturer in social entrepreneurship at the Yale School of Management. Before joining the faculty at Yale, she launched the first venture philanthropy organization in her home country, Lebanon, providing tailored financial and critical management support to social enterprises serving marginalized populations through education, job creation for youth and for women. Teresa, thank you very much for taking the time to join us. It's really great to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's pretty cool to be sitting here in New Haven chatting with someone in Shanghai about these global issues.
So as a starting point, it'd be great to have a personal introduction. And what is the mission that you're on?
What is the mission that I'm on? The mission that I'm on, broadly speaking, is to increase access to information, skills, and even mindsets to change makers around the world. And I say that because, by way of personal introduction, you mentioned I'm from Lebanon. I also had the huge luck and privilege of being born in the US during the Lebanese Civil War in the 1970s. And so, because of my US citizenship, I had the opportunity to pursue the highest education I could ever dream of, which I would not have been able to without being a US citizen, mostly for funding reasons. And I feel so lucky that I have been exposed to the knowledge and skills and mindsets that allow me to see myself as a change maker. And a lot of people where I come from and here in the US and around the world haven't had that exposure and are feeling largely helpless and hopeless about the problems we face as a society and about the role that they could potentially play.
Yeah, and I like those, how you kind of put those two things together. For me, that's where, like, you can call it entrepreneurship or like, that's where I think like the ability of an individual to have a change is so powerful, even if it's very small.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't have to be that you are starting this whole new company and getting venture financing and all those things that people traditionally associate with the word entrepreneurship. It could be that you're just participating in existing efforts, whether they be for profit, nonprofit, or even just not any organization, just like grassroots organizing and civic action and campaigns and volunteering. And so just giving yourself permission to see the problems and, more importantly, to see yourself as being part of an effort or part of the work to tackle those problems. It's not that I want anyone to think that they're going to be the hero or that they're going to solve these problems, but just that there are people out there doing the work, and that I think each person gets to decide to what degree and how they can be part of that.
With that, like, what was your own journey into this space, into social entrepreneurship, and what sparked your interest or what catalyzed you to say, I want to enter the space, I want to, one, build your previous organization, but also to teach this topic?
So for me, I studied public health. My first job was in public health. I worked on a UNFPA project at the Ministry of Social Affairs in Lebanon. And then I decided to go to graduate school and study public health at the doctoral degree level. And when I was doing that, I thought I would be studying how to make the world better, how to change the world. But instead, what I was really doing was studying the problems and running multivariable, multi-level regression models, analyzing the problems. And so when I graduated, I decided I didn't want to do more research, even though research is so important and we need it. But at the time, I felt that our actions have not yet caught up with the amount of research and knowledge and evidence we've generated. And I just had this restlessness where I wanted to see the impact of my work. And I started pitching ideas about what that could look like. And I was getting the feedback from people like, yeah, this exists. It's a thing. People are doing it. It's called social entrepreneurship. So that's how I decided, okay, that's what I'm going to do. When I graduate, I'm going to work in social entrepreneurship. I had the opportunity to connect with Al-Fanar Venture Philanthropy. And it's the first venture philanthropy organization in the Arab countries. Initially, they started in Egypt. And when I connected with them, they were hoping to expand into Lebanon. So I got to launch Al Fanad Lebanon. And it was the best of both worlds because I was starting something new, but with the support of an existing infrastructure. And I kind of had to figure it out as I went along. And as I did that, I went back to my alma mater and said, this is unacceptable. I spent 5 years at Harvard and I never heard about social entrepreneurship. And now I'm figuring it out as I went along. And so I went back and pitched a course to add it to the curriculum. And that's how I started teaching social entrepreneurship while practicing it.
So in that early phase, you heard about social entrepreneurship, you go into this venture philanthropy. What was the working definition you had of a social entrepreneur at the time, or like the potential for scale, or what their role was in solving these problems?
I like to just say it's about being entrepreneurial, about solving social problems, thinking about how you can mobilize resources in a new and innovative way to create positive social outcomes. And an existing definition that resonated a lot with me was published by Roger Martin and Sally Osberg, where they said that social entrepreneurs identify a stable but inherently unjust equilibrium and then envision a potential new and more just status quo or way of being, and then apply their creativity and their networks to implement their vision and to build an ecosystem around it so that they create a new and more just equilibrium. And I love that because it could include entrepreneurship, which is starting a new organization. It could include intrapreneurship, which is innovating within existing institutions. And it could include extrapreneurship, which means not even constraining yourself to the boundaries of any one organization, but innovating across the boundaries of multiple institutions, which I think both entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs need to do.
What have you seen, I guess, in the last 10, 12 years that you've been in the space? And what are some things, I mean, within that working definition that you think that are either working or are evolving over this time that you've been, participating in this?
So it's been like 15 years now that I've been in this space. And I think the really nice thing that I'm seeing is that most people are just over it. 25 years ago, at the turn of the millennium, people got really into this concept of social entrepreneurship. The way I interpret it is that at the time, it was like there were all these internet entrepreneurs that had successfully done these startups in Silicon Valley and were shifting their focus to solving social problems. And so this concept of social entrepreneurship really picked up and it became a system just like any others, and any system over time will have its pros or cons and will have ways in which it propagates the status quo, even the system that's trying to change the status quo. And then everyone tries to kind of like, including myself, get into that system and get in with the buzzwords and start applying it and teaching it and writing about it. And then you kind of just get over it. And I think a lot of people are over it in so many ways. We need to just put aside the concept and the buzz around social entrepreneurship and think about social change and social progress and how are we going to create that and how innovation and entrepreneurship is one small part of that. And one of the things that I'm kind of over is that we're using these capitalistic concepts and terminologies like entrepreneurship to talk about solving problems that were caused by capitalism. And also that there's such individualistic concepts and terminologies that place the burden on my students and you and me and others to imagine and implement and scale these programs and products. And A, that doesn't work. B, no one should be doing this alone. It's mostly that we need this collective action where we're all working together and no one's being the hero.
I think it's interesting because you go to the tech, I guess the tech bros as it were, like the Silicon Valley as a start. And when I got started, it wasn't so much Silicon Valley, although the John Wood book was kind of formative, I think, for many people in this region, but it was definitely, let's call it second generation wealth, reformed bankers, accountants, lawyers, consultants, or successful entrepreneurs looking to like, I won't say like they were, some were trying to repair a legacy, some were trying to build another legacy, but some were just like, wow, the system's really broken. And it wasn't, and I feel like to your point about capitalism fixing capitalism or using capitalistic tools to fix capital, yeah, we do have that belief that we have to, or I guess core to this has been, you have to have a business model that kind of fixes old business models, but without actually fixing those business models first. And so I feel like, yes, there's a bit of circularity to this, and we haven't really made the progress we have. I just never really thought about it in the same terms.
And also, you don't always need a business model. So, one of the courses I teach at Yale is public health entrepreneurship. And my students really push back on why am I making the business case and the economic case for achieving the public health mission. If you apply the health and human rights framework to achieving public health outcomes, that means it doesn't always have to have an economic case. It absolutely does have an economic case. We all do better when we all do better. But also sometimes you just do something because that's the right thing to do.
So with that, I want to kind of traverse into the work that you're doing through the Social Innovation Initiative, as well as through your classes. Can you talk a little about the work that you're doing at Yale, the class that you're teaching, and maybe even maybe just kind of talk through some of the concepts that you've been teaching or the students that you've been teaching, like.
Sure. So at Yale, I initially was recruited by the program on entrepreneurship at the Yale School of Management, was full-time there for 5 years, and then a new school launched at Yale, kind of like a startup within this ancient institution called the Jackson School of Global Affairs. And I teach a couple of different courses that students from both of these schools take, also students from the Yale School of Public Health, School of the Environment, Yale Divinity School. The course that I just finished teaching in the first half of the spring semester, which started 2 days after inauguration when our country and our world really changed, is called Public Health Entrepreneurship. Public health entrepreneurship is based on health equity, which means that everybody has an equal opportunity to access the things that they need to be healthy. I've never before in my life thought about whether any one of my students is a Republican or a Democrat. Like, it never occurred to me to wonder. But this semester, I found myself wondering because the national dialogue is just so divisive. I was kind of nervous that I was walking into a landmine, but people were so respectful, so dedicated to the topic, and nobody disagreed on the core issues. It's just that they disagree about how to get there. And so what I thought would be a very difficult and scary time to teach this topic turned into a very hopeful time because it reminded me of several things. First, there are amazing innovators out there doing incredible work to help people get the things they need to be healthy, and they have hope. And so that gives us hope. And second, it's good to disagree. We learn by disagreeing, we learn by having different perspectives. And if we had it figured out, these problems wouldn't persist. So clearly we don't know what we're doing and we need to listen to different perspectives. So that's kind of the vibe on campus right now. Yeah, it's an interesting time.
There's so many changes happening in the world right now, from politics, obviously, demographics, technology, economy, values shifting. Like there's 10 different things that are seismically shifting around the world. And one of the things I keep coming back to is like, now's a time for people who are focused on solving real problems to really sharpen their tool sets. And there's plenty of ways to solve things, be it profit, nonprofit, policy, like you've mentioned a few of them. And so I'm kind of curious, like, are your students driven to, like, are they coming to your class to learn how to solve problems? And are you trying to teach them to become entrepreneurs, or you just give them the mindset tool set of entrepreneurs so no matter where they are, they can do this? And then how do you make this real for them?
Okay, so I'll start with the first question you asked about what am I trying to do with them? Do I want them to launch their startups, or do I want them to just be entrepreneurial in whatever setting they're working in? And it's mostly the second. I always tell my students, most of you are going to graduate and get a job. That's what most people do, right? And whatever job you have, whether you work in a bank or an investment fund or a public school or a nonprofit, whatever job you have, even if you don't self-identify as a public health person, you will absolutely impact these drivers of health. You will always have the opportunity wherever you work, whatever job you have, to mobilize resources in a different way to create positive social outcomes. And that's the entrepreneurial mindset and skill set that I want everyone to have. Bill Drayton, the founder of Ashoka, says everyone that works at Ashoka is a social entrepreneur. They didn't start their own organization, but they think and act like a social entrepreneur. And so that really resonates with me and with my students. And this year, I told my students on the first day of class, I just want to let you know that you're not going to solve the world's problems. And that whatever you try, statistically speaking, the most likely outcome is failure. So let me just remove that pressure off your shoulders from now. You will fail to solve the world's problems. But why are you here? Why are we here today? We're here because no matter how scary the world gets, you will always find people out there doing the work to try to make it better. And you get to decide to what degree and how you get to be part of doing that work. That's why we're here. And so your second question about how do I make it real is a really good question, because we are in the ivory tower, right? And it helps when we do this cases and when we have entrepreneurs come in person or Zoom in to talk about their work, and when students engage with the questions that these entrepreneurs are grappling with. But there's really only so much we can do in the classroom. And like you said, students just have to get out there in the real world and talk to people, and more importantly, listen to people. I mean, at Yale, we live in a bubble, and most Yale students never really get to know the community around them. They don't talk to their unhoused neighbors. They don't visit the small and medium enterprises that, started by immigrants. And I always tell students, there are social innovators right here in New Haven. You don't have to look that far. And so why can't you just get to know them?
I can imagine, I teach as well, and I bring a lot of examples in, but I will look at the standard social innovation, social entrepreneurship class to be like, it just doesn't work. Like it's not, it might be very useful, but it won't necessarily be activating. And I'm curious, how do you leverage your experience to kind of bring in that special sauce that a pure academic who's just studied this wouldn't have?
I think they both inform each other. So when I first started teaching social entrepreneurship almost 15 years ago, questions came up in my teaching that I would then apply in my practice to figure out, and also questions would come up in my practice that I would then apply in my research and teaching to figure out. And so when I created the textbook for the course, it was really informed by this two-way dialogue. Like, the book informed the teaching, but it was also informed by the practice, which was informed by the teaching. And so it is a very practice-based book and a practice-based method where it provides a 10-stage framework to help students organize their thoughts, because that's what I needed when I was a student. I didn't know where to start. I wanted to be an innovator. I wanted to be daring and creative, but I didn't know how to get started. I didn't have an amazing idea. And what this book and what this framework tells you, and now it's available to all our listeners through a free online course on Coursera called Creating Change Through Social Entrepreneurship. It's the same course that I teach at Yale. It's the same content in the book. This framework tells you you don't need to start with an idea. In fact, it's better if you don't. You start with the problem, you study the problem and get to know its root causes. You talk to, or more importantly, listen to the people affected by the problem, those working on it. You find out what has worked before, what hasn't, and why. And then you just get involved. And through this immersion, something emerges that can be your offering. And I try to avoid the word your solution, because again, you're not going to solve this problem, but like, you can contribute something. So you can design an offering, develop your ideas further, and then think about what success looks like and how you'd measure that. how you might be financially viable, how you might structure as an organization if you need to, how will you communicate and pitch your idea to various stakeholders, how would you fund it, and this 10th stage is thinking about expanding your impact. And that's different from scaling your organization. Expanding your impact often means looking beyond your organization to see how you can impact policy.
Interesting. If you think about those 10, kind of steps in the framework, what are like the most challenging, or what are the ones that you feel that people trip up on the most frequently when you're looking
I
at
think
either the
success
projects or,
metrics.
I'm sorry?
Yeah. I think success metrics is what people trip up on most frequently. And success metrics is basically the bottom line of any social endeavor. So you need to ask yourself from the outset, what does success look like and how will you measure it? And this is one of the key distinctions between social and commercial innovation and entrepreneurship, right? Because in commercial entrepreneurship, it's very easy to measure success. There's one universal bottom line, which is the dollar sign or whatever currency you're working with. But in social endeavors, it's about the social change you're creating. So, depending on the endeavor, it could be learning outcomes in an education setting, health outcomes in a health setting, et cetera. And so, it's going to be unique to each organization, and it's up to the team to figure out when they fast forward 5, 10, 15, 20 years, what would they have liked to change about the world? And how can they, in the most seamless, low resource way possible, measure that as part of delivering the work? And so that's really important, and communicating it is important. And then for funders and investors, it's also really tricky because then when you're evaluating across different organizations, you're comparing apples and oranges, right? Like, how do you aggregate when each person has a, and how do you compare when each person has a different bottom line? So for many different people in and players in the ecosystem, this is the tricky part.
Yeah, I would also argue it's made more tricky because so few people in the ecosystem have on the ground experience. They're often coming in and kind of assessing an organization as a former consultant, banker, accountant, investor, or whatever it might be, and they're trying to find that commonality when they don't understand like the root causes, say homelessness or elderly or like whatever the food justice or whatever the issue is that they say that they want to participate in. And I don't mean that as like a judgment of intent. Like I think a lot of people come in with the intention to be additive or to actually to solve the problem. And they think that because they were successful at something else or they have the funding, all that's missing is the funding. It's like, well, actually, there's so many nuanced things here.
I just want to build on what you're saying before you ask your question, because you're talking about something so important, and it might actually have been your next question. But what happens a lot is that people are used to quantifying and standardizing things, right? That they're trying to help when they do that. Sometimes the most easy and obvious way is through numbers of lives reached. And we've made that mistake at Al Fanad, right? We talk about the number of people we've reached. But sometimes our most impactful investees have reached the least people. And it's not about the number of people we've reached, jobs we've created. It's also about the shifts that are happening in that community where each person, and I see this with Havenly in New Haven, where each person is recognizing their sense of agency, seeing themselves as a change maker. So how do we capture those kinds of outcomes, which that's how we're going to change the world? We're not McDonald's. We're not aiming to serve millions. How do you compare something like that with an organization that said, oh yeah, I reached 1 million people? So that mental shift is really where I struggle. And that's what my research at Yale is doing with Havenly. We're trying to measure those more qualitative changes like agency compared to numbers of women reached.
We oft, like you said, that we're not here for the numbers, but in reality, I think a lot of organizations center themselves around the easy numbers because that's what it's easiest to communicate and therefore drive interest in your into your work or into your research or into your impact. I also think like this is also just a reflection of the fact that so little research has gone into actually creating, I don't know, true standards or true metrics that people can look at. And I go back to, I'm taking the ESG certification at the CFA Institute right now, been studying for that. And there's like a 450-page book, and only 20 of it is on S. Everything else is E and G. there's just so little work that's gone into this because I think S has been forgotten. Like I think the human impact has often been the last thing that's been measured in a lot of this because everyone's looking at the high level numbers as being the most investable numbers. And by investment, that could be a donation, that could be a grant, that could be, philanthropic capital, it could be
And
whatever.
it
Because
is easier to quantify the E. So, for those of our listeners who aren't familiar, ESG is environmental, social, and governance. And so the environmental aspects are actually easier to quantify because you have tons of carbon emitted, and the social is the trickier part. And so that really resonates what you're saying about the CFA training.
so then to your question of Havenly, like how do you approach that differently? And not only like the measurement and trying to learn how to quantify it or even turn turn that into qualification, like how do you approach that measurement differently? And then after you have the information, are you finding that's also important to communicate differently as well? Because it used to be like one statistic, a picture, maybe a quote. Like, do you now get more, do you try and aim for more depth, or is it just more content that gets deeper and deeper and deeper? That way, those who are interested and want to follow that, like, how do you communicate this more robust measurement, kind of system? And is it more for the internal stuff, or is it for the external? I need your money.
That is such a great question, and it is absolutely for both. It's mostly for the external. And the reason, one of the motivations behind this research project that started doing with Havenly is to educate investors, especially funders, because funders are kind of behind the problem why innovators are measuring this way, because they're trying to impress the funders. So funders are propagating this problem of picking the one that reaches the most people. And so we're trying to educate them about like, what is your end game? Why are you doing this? What changes are you hoping to create in the world? So Havenly's mission is such a great example of that. They actually changed it over time. When they first started, I don't even remember what their historical mission was, but it really was about numbers, about like, training women, helping them get jobs. It even started with like baklava, selling baklava. It was like very quantifiable. Now their mission is building community power among refugee and migrant women. How do you measure that? How do you communicate that? How do you compete for funds? What started as like Likert scale type interviews, but then really iterated and expanded into more open-ended interviews where women were just sharing their stories, and we were then coding them and creating models and frameworks that capture how agency shows up and evolves over time in this community. And so it is much harder to capture and to communicate, but to bring it back to the practice and back to how someone can operationalize this, even before we've published our results of how does agency show up and evolve over time, something really cool happened, which is that Havenly got a new CRM, client relations manager, which is a software that they use to track data and report impact. And they added 3 questions into the CRM from our like the 3 core questions from our interview guide. And so they now are capturing this data as part of their work and communicating as part of their reporting to the foundations and state agencies, et cetera, who support them. And so that's definitely a start.
Mm. So this is a kind of an extension of the school. So I'm just going to ask a broader question. What's the role of academia in the industry or in delivering impact or delivering better outcomes? Like as you have your students that you're training, that you're building capacity, that are maybe going out and doing some projects, and hopefully you're inspiring to take on something wider in the future. But then you also have these engagements with your community where you're helping them to better themselves. So what do you view your role as an academic into, just more broadly in the space? Like,
Let me use Ashoka's 4 levels of change framework to answer your question, where the first level is direct service, like a teacher teaching a student. The second level is scaled service, like, you know, many schools reaching many students. The third level is systems change, like how can we improve the education system through policy, et cetera. And the fourth level is framework change, like how can we kind of make the current system obsolete and come up with even new and more powerful frameworks. On the framework change level, which is kind of the broadest impact, I see our role as creating new ways, new frameworks to help people think differently about social problems within and outside campus, right? Like what I do with my podcast and my online course through Coursera and my book and publications is try to help practitioners and policymakers think about things differently in terms of where and how can we focus our efforts and resources to shift the status quo. In terms of systems change, we generate data through our research that can inform policy, right? We can sometimes be even more directly involved as consultants or something to change, to improving systems. And then in terms of direct service and scaled direct service, I think that needs to happen both within and outside the classroom. So the most obvious way is that we're teaching people that will go out there and make the world better. But yet, how can we also have that direct service and scaled service right here in New Haven or in other parts of the world? How can our teaching and our research directly impact others? And so yesterday, I was interviewing a woman named Cameron Smith who runs an organization called Communities in Partnership. That's a public health, drivers of health organization. And she was telling me, you know, academics are kind of so colonial. She didn't use that word, but like they like study people and people don't like being studied. It's very extractive. That's the word she used. So how can we not be extractive in our research and just take information from a community? How can we leave a community stronger and more powerful through that research and through that collaboration? That's the role that I think we must play. I think it's a moral imperative. And I don't think it takes away from our bottom line of teaching and researching and publishing and, you know, giving people great education. I think it adds to it.
But it takes a little bit more thought and a lot more work. So, yeah, I think that's why a
It
lot of
takes a little bit
schools.
more thought. I don't think it takes more work. I think it's a redirection of the work. Academics do so much work. They're just like hamsters on a wheel, like most people in this world, you know? But if you think very thoughtfully and mindfully about where you're going to direct that energy and those hours and those resources, it's not more work, but it does definitely takes more thought.
So, a couple last questions that come up on the thought side. What advice would you give to up and coming academics or researchers who want to enter the space?
My advice is to draw on your lived experience as much, if not more, than your fancy degrees and what people have trained you in. People have trained you in how to propagate the status quo. If you want to do that, you are well qualified to do that. But if you want to disrupt the status quo, you are also qualified to do that through your lived experience. What are the problems that you have faced personally and engaged with personally or professionally, or your loved ones or your community? What are the relationships and social networks that you have? And how can you leverage those to do things differently, like we were saying a few minutes ago, to put some thought into where you're and how you're going to direct your energy and time and resources in a way that makes a difference. And I acknowledge that sometimes that's different from what will get you tenure. I acknowledge that sometimes to have job security, you just have to keep your head down and crunch out the numbers. So I do want to acknowledge the realities and the difficulties of that. But my hope is that the more people start thinking about their real world impact, then one day, hopefully, they will be the ones making those decisions and finding ways to value different ways of doing things that won't take away from the academic robustness of knowledge and data and research generated, but will actually make it richer.
I struggle with that one because I feel like we're in the space to really change things. And so to play the game until you're in a position of change it, it's like you're still falling those same traps sometimes. I guess to that point, like if you're gonna like encourage someone to find ways to disrupt and use their experience, are there particular areas or questions or things that you think are really underexplored right now in terms of this kind of in between social innovation, entrepreneurship, community, and academia right now?
No, I think that each person, each academic, each practitioner, each innovator can have their own set of questions. And whatever the things are that you already really care about, just find your own way to pursue those. And also remember that your life has many phases and many chapters.